So with the end of World War One, we see that this has been a massive time of significant change in not just the United States, but around the world. Now, you may recall from chapter 20 that as the end of the First World War approached, the United States ends up entering into the war as kind of an associated power, not really an ally. And the United States enters into this in 1917. Now, the Great War actually began way back in 1914, and the Allies during this war were France, Great Britain, and Russia. Now, Russia had to leave the war, so to speak, in 1917 because they had their own developments taking place. And I'll tell you about that part in just a moment. But just to remind you, the Central Powers were Germany and Austria and Hungary. And so these nations are really warring. They're fighting over land and territory, influence the ability to conduct business, to engage in trade. And France, Russia, Great Britain are no different. Remember that Russia had actually moved into Japan's cause. Some states was earned about proximity to. Now, as the war is waging on, the United States becomes involved around the same time that Russia withdraws. And this is really important because Russia sort of says, okay, we're done, we're tapping out. And they kind of enter into a agreement directly with Germany, and the groups sort of call a truce. Now, this is facilitated by the Bolshevik Revolution. And it's important to know that this Russian Revolution really begins in 1917, and the Russian Revolution really is a threat to capitalism. Now, because the USSR, Russia, had entered into this agreement with Germany from World War II, this really causes some frustrations and some concerns for Wilson once the war has ended. Now, just to make sure that everyone is familiar with the Russian Revolution and kind of the partners and the play there, this really begins again in 1917, and it's near the end of World War One, and it really, again, it removes Russia from power. But it also brings about a transformation of the Russian Empire into a union of the Soviet Socialist republics. And so that's where we get the term USSR. And it replaces the traditional monarchy in Russia with the world's first communist state. Now, you may remember Eugene Debs in the United States, who really is advocating long before this Russian Revolution for communist ideas and communist governments to be set up even here in the United States. Now, the revolution really takes place in stages, and there's two separate coups. There is a coup or a takeover in February, and then one later in October. And this new government is led by a man named Vladimir Lenin. And this rise to power of Vladimir Lenin is really not solidified until 3 years after this war in Russia. And so it doesn't become solidified until 1920. Again, this is long after the end of the First World War. This is after Wilson is trying to campaign across the United States to get Americans interested and involved and concerned about that League of Nations to prevent any other type of war. Now, Wilson recognizes that because the USSR has a massive population, a lot of people, and now they have this communist government, that they really have people to send into war if need be. Now, the events of the Russian Revolution actually happened very abruptly, but the groundwork was laid for almost 100 years up to this particular point. Now, Nicholas II was the Tsar who actually led Russia in the years leading up to the revolution. And Nicholas had personally witnessed the revolutionary terrorist assassinate his grandfather and even his own father, respond to the assassination through a brutal oppression of the Russian people. When Nicholas himself became the Tsar in 1894, he used the same types of severe measures to quash any resistance, any rebellion. And we want to understand this because part of what makes the United States a unique country is that we are founded on this idea that the people can sort of shake off the chains of tyranny and overthrow their government. Now, this course is not about world history or Russian history, but it's important to understand what's going on in this major central power. This major ally power in World War I, because those ideas that are put in place in the USSR will continue to come to the forefront through the next 120 years of American history. So again, the success of the Bolshevik Revolution creates a Comintern in 1919. And this really causes Americans to be very fearful. And so this particular time is called the Red Scare, and we'll dig more into the Red Scare in just a moment. But it's a time when Americans are very concerned about um, potential communists everywhere. Now, in chapter 19, near the end, we talked about that Espionage Act and the Sedition Acts that Congress implements to keep Americans, any Americans, from speaking out against the government, from being critical of the government, from doing anything that would undermine the war effort. Now, there are two specific court cases that you want to be familiar with. And the first one that we're going to talk about is Abrams v. United States. Now, in Abrams v. United States, the Supreme Court actually upholds the convictions of Jacob Abrams, who was an anarchist, and several others who had urged workers to strike, but they had also distributed leaflets and pamphlets that said that the war was not beneficial and that the people were not being treated fairly, and they ultimately had the right to um, resist, to go on strike. Now, the other court case that we want to talk about is the Schneck, and it's a hard one to spell. The Schneck v. United States case. And with this particular case, the United States Supreme Court really embodies the fear that many Americans feel. Charles Schneck was found to be in violation of the Espionage Act because he had mailed thousands of leaflets out to people in which he opposed the military draft that had been implemented as a response to the First World War. Now, what's important to understand here is that there was a presence of radicals in the United States at this particular time. And these numbers of radicals were relatively small, but the fear or the concern was really that they might cause more people to question the government. So we enter into a time where it's known as the Red Scare, and it's a time when Americans in general are very anxious and they are very concerned about what is going on in the world and in the United States. This is still at a time when we are seeing immigration, we are seeing a lot of different ideas, a lot of diverse peoples coming into the United States. So the fear of radicalism was exacerbated by the fact that we see a slow economic growth period. We see inflation where the value of items is really not equal to their monetary value. And at the same time, we also see weakened agricultural production at the end of World War I. Remember, we had shored up agricultural production, industrial production to aid the war effort. And now that the war has ended, we don't necessarily need the same numbers of products. Now, in 1919, there was a lot of anti-union sentiment, as well as this economic hardship that people have been enduring. Now, remember, unions have been unpopular, and then they experienced a surge in popularity, and then they see a dip in popularity. And so by 1919, 1920, unions are kind of on the downward dip again. And at the same time that this lack of popularity nationwide is present for unions, people who are members of unions, or even not members of unions, but people who are working in different industries, begin to strike. And so there are a series of coordinated strikes in the steel, transportation, and shipbuilding industries, as well as in law enforcement. Though most of the strikers were really ordinary workers, they were not radicals, they were not communists, many of them weren't even affiliated with unions. The media and the government really worked to highlight communist and socialist influence, and this creates what is known as the Red Scare. The radicals exacerbated the sense of fear by mailing these incendiary devices to well-known Americans and detonating bombs in 8 cities, including one outside of the home of U.S. Attorney General Mitchell Palmer. Now, again, these are radicals, so these are not the everyday strikers. These are those small pockets of radicals. Palmer responded by ratcheting up investigatory efforts to find out who these radicals are, who are these communist sympathizers, and to address this problem. Now, Palmer selects J. Edgar Hoover to head the General Intelligence Division in the Department of Justice, and as a result of that, authorized the roundup of hundreds of suspected radicals, most of whom were just immigrants. They weren't necessarily associated with communism, but they were immigrants, so they had not fully assimilated. In the Palmer raids, investigators detained and interrogated thousands of suspects without legal counsel and held them without any charges. And eventually, more than 500 were actually deported. Now, remember, part of the foundation of the United States and the Constitution says that if you are arrested, then you do need to be able to defend yourself. You have to be told what you're being accused of. But the rules didn't really apply to these immigrants to these suspected radicals at this particular time, because the fear of this communist invasion was much more concerning to Americans. The Americans initially really supported the raids. They believed that this was the best way to address the problem. Many, over time, grew very wary of the government's violations of civil liberties. And this leads to the formation of the American Civil Liberties Union in 1920. Intensifying anxieties created by the Red Scare was an influenza epidemic that begins in 1918 and really ends in 1920. And during this influenza epidemic, more than 675,000 Americans died. Now, it's important to understand that this is actually a pandemic because it's something that is impacting the entire world. The promise of jobs in northern industries during World War I inspired more than 400,000 African Americans to move north in what became known as the Great Migration. Though they did have some success in finding industry jobs, blacks migrating to the north encountered racism and discrimination in employment and in housing. Racial tensions spurred by a series of race riots throughout the United States in 1919. The worst took place in Chicago during what was called the Red Summer. For 13 days, black and white rioters attacked homes, businesses, and each other in response to the drowning of a black boy who had accidentally swam into the whites-only section of Lake Michigan. Remember, even in the North, segregation and Jim Crow reign, just as they reign in the South. 15 whites and 23 blacks died during the Chicago riots, and more than 500 people were injured. In the context of these riots, this race conflict in places like Chicago, we see a revitalization or a rebirth, a reinvention, if you will, of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. The dramatic growth of the economy in the 1920s resulted from the government's collaboration with business, in spite of claims that those in power supported laissez-faire principles. Now, laissez-faire, again, is this idea of the government staying out of business and letting the market regulate itself. However, the reality was that government and business were already very much intertwined. As a candidate for president, Warren G. Harding declared that the Republicans wanted less government in business and more business in government. After Harding became president, his cabinet included business leaders who embraced the same philosophy. Now, it's this idea that the government shouldn't interfere with business, but that the government should be operated like a business. Under Harding, the tax rates for millionaires dropped dramatically. Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon believed that this tactic would generate growth by providing the wealthy with incentives to take economic risks, to create new businesses, which would in turn create job opportunities, and this would lead to more employment among the American people. With greater employment, Americans would have the ability to buy products, goods, and services. Government support for the wealthy was accompanied by a decline in regulatory attention to big business. Most instrumental in creating collaboration between the public and private sectors was Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover, who rejected government regulation of business in favor of a voluntary cooperation between both sides. Hoover believed that the government and businesses should just play nice with one another, that they should not be meddling too greatly in one another's business. Now, under the American plan, the Harding administration encouraged businesses to provide health care and pensions to workers to stem the effectiveness of and the need for unions. Remember, unions are advocating for things like insurance in case of injury, sick leave, shorter work days, retirement, those types of things. And this American plan basically posits that if businesses go ahead and give the workers the things that they need, then the unions will go away. By the end of the 1920s, union membership declined dramatically. In 1921, the Teapot Dome scandal, in which Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall and Secretary of the Navy Edwin Denby collaborated in transferring the naval oil reserves to the Interior Department, which then distributed the properties to private companies, including the Mammoth Oil Company. Fall received compensation from Sinclair of more than $300,000 for this handout. Now, these two men were, of course, caught for their wrongdoing. They were convicted and sentenced to jail. After Harding's death in 1923, President Calvin Coolidge assumed the presidency, and he really tried to distance himself from the scandals that were associated with the previous administration. At the same time, he really promised the American people that he would keep the policies that Harding had put into place, particularly those policies that encouraged the government and business to work together and to cooperate with one another. Now, the growth of business means a growth in the wealth among individuals, as seen by the per capita income increase of 32%. Now, it is important to understand that a per capita income increase means that all people are experiencing an increase in their income. So the poorest person as well as the wealthiest person is benefiting during this particular time. Obviously, if you are a person who is earning more than $300,000 a year, then your 32% is very big. But if you are a person who is accustomed to living on $1,000 a year and you experience this 32% increase, this feels like the era of good times. The expansion of industry resulted in new technologies, shifts in management, and the widespread application of the assembly line to the production of consumer goods. Now, the assembly line is where each worker is assigned one aspect of production. And rather than a person doing all of the work to create a final product, there would be people who did just one task, and this would speed up the time in which work could be completed and which products could be produced. This is perfected in the automobile industry. The time that it took to build a single car was reduced from 12 and a half hours to less than 1 minute. The assembly line decreased the price of goods as well because it lowered the overall cost of production. Now we can make these products much, much, much more quickly, which means we are able to sell more products. Streamlined production and increased income bred the second industrial revolution. Remember, we've had the first industrial revolution where we switched to more mechanized labor. Now we're seeing a assembly line application, which is this sort of second industrial revolution. And as a result, we see household technologies and appliances that facilitate housework become very important components of this second industrial revolution. Radios became a key source of household entertainment, allowing families to hear music, theater, sports, politics, and religious sermons without ever leaving their homes. None of the new household items revolutioned the American life as much as the car, which nourished the growth of related industries and profoundly shaped American culture. The rise of the automobile led to improvements in roadways and expanding leisure and tourist industries, particularly in places like Florida, which drew annual vacationers to its beaches and national parks. For young people, automobiles changed courtship practices, which traditionally had involved some form of adult supervision or a crowd setting. So prior to the automobile, if young people wanted to court, as they would say, um, the young man would need to go and get permission from a father, and then they might go to a school event, they might go to a community event, they might go to one another's respective homes with their parents. But the automobile changes this because it allows for privacy. And as a result of this, we see an increase in sexual experimentation and sexual activity among young people. Now, that's not to say that young people had not engaged in these activities prior to the 1920s, but it became easier to engage in those activities with greater privacy and more frequency. Sustained consumer industry growth in the 1920s depended on the continual demand. So business leaders mobilized the young advertising industry to make goods appealing on both a practical and an emotional level. And consumers were really encouraged to think of their social standing with every purchase. So it became very important that if you were considered a middle class person, that you would have certain items in your homes. Most Americans in the 1920s spent beyond their means in this age of consumption, and it really depends on the credit that's available. And credit allows them to buy goods now and pay for those goods later. This particular approach led American consumers to be $3 billion in debt. Now, my question to you is, which group of people do you think is in debt in this $3 billion of debt? Do you think it's the wealthiest? Do you think it's the middle class? Or do you think it's the poorer people? And the correct answer is it's largely the poorest people. Certainly some of the middle class do incur debt, but they already had a little extra income before that this 1920s period. Now, if you're looking here at the chart, which discusses the production of consumer goods, what you see is between 1921 and 1929. And you see that automobiles in 1921, people are purchasing those. But by the end of the 1920s, that number has increased at least 3 times. Now, phonographs stay about the same through that particular time period. And a phonograph is sort of like a record player. But the radio receivers, which are invented during this particular time, are increasing from, basically nothing to almost 5,000 thousandths. And what this tells me, and I am telling you, is that the ability to consume information, whether that is for entertainment, enlightenment, knowledge, spiritual well-being, was made much easier, and people sincerely wanted to be informed and engaged. And then finally, refrigerators, which are also created and developed in the 1920s. Um, Not ice boxes, actual refrigerators. We do see those become items of luxury and status as well. So it's important to understand here that many poor people did not have refrigerators, they didn't have automobiles, but they had those radio receivers. They had the ability to get information. Now, this is an advertisement for a refrigerator, and it's an advertisement from General Electric, and you can go in and read the entire advertisement if you would like. But what I want to point you to here is one, there's a certain status associated with this refrigerator and with this woman. Part of that is evidenced in her dress. Part of that is advertised is very evident in the fact that this refrigerator is absolutely full. And if you're looking outside of the window here, you can see a car. So all of these things really become symbols of what it means to have status and wealth in the United States. Now, the growth of cities aided in the spread of a consumer-oriented economy. As more people flocked to the cities, advertisers had a more accessible base to target. So as more people are coming into the cities, it's much easier to convince them that they need to buy those products. After World War I, the demand for agricultural goods decreased. And as a result of this, many farmers left the farm and moved into the cities looking for work. In the 1920 census, we find that for the first time in American history, the majority of Americans live in cities in the United States. The West also experienced a higher growth than any other region in the country. People moved west to the milder climate, and cities like Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, and Los Angeles boomed. But in spite of the genuine prosperity of the 1920s, there were hints about an impending financial collapse. Many people ignored them. Key among them was economic inequality. Now, less than 1% of American families were in possession of 34% of the nation's savings. Now, when we talk about savings, what we mean is money that's saved in the bank that isn't already allotted to go to certain bills. So this isn't your paycheck. This is money that you have saved that you don't need. 34% of the nation's savings is held by 1% of the people. More than three-quarters, or more than 75% of American families had no savings, which means every penny that they earn is spent before their next check. In an economy that was driven by escalating consumption of new goods, only the wealthy and the middle class could really afford to purchase new items. But they couldn't endlessly buy new goods just to keep the economy going. The expansion of credit masked the economic weaknesses, but gradually the demand decreased and unemployment increased. Eventually, the automobile and housing industries began to bear the burden of the impact of the struggling economy. Now, wealthier individuals had amassed remarkable savings, and they took a lot of economic risks. They bought stocks on credit, and they bought this stock without any government regulation. Remember this idea of keeping the government out of business. Banks and lenders expanded credit without any concern for the potential consequences. So banks gave credit to people who really had no financial means of repaying that debt. Businessmen created an interlocking system of corporate ownership and control, which meant that one company's failure could cause the collapse of many other companies. Real estate developers in Florida engaged in risky speculation. They bought land and properties from afar, assuming that the land would either hold its value or increase its value. But between 1926 and 1928, there were a lot of storms in Florida, and this leads to a decline in the value of property. And this really should have been a red flag to most people that these practices were not working. But the reality is that the number of people that were impacted at this point were so small that no one really took notice. Agricultural prices declined over the 1920s as a result in the decreased demand from the world market. Remember, the United States agriculture is in high demand during World War I, but by the 1920s, the war has ended and those economies in Europe have started to recover. We also see tenant farmers and sharecroppers in the South primarily who have been working as these agrarian laborers. And as a result of the decrease in the demand for those agricultural products, these sharecroppers and tenant farmers began to migrate into the north and into the west looking for jobs. And sometimes they found jobs, and many times they did not find jobs. The global economy of the 1920s really belied the prosperity in the United States. Allied countries were unable to repay $11 billion that they had borrowed from the United States during World War I. So not only are businessmen engaging in risky speculation and amassing a lot of debt, the working class people are also amassing debt. But at the same time, the United States isn't able to collect the debts that are owed to the United States. Now, the recovery is really dependent on Germany, which is very destitute, actually repaying their reparations. So the United States has lent all of this money to Great Britain, to France during World War I. And these countries basically say, yes, we'll pay you back as soon as Germany repays what they owe us. Well, guess what? A lot of World War I is fought in Germany, and so the German economy hasn't recovered. And so they can't pay their debt, which means which means Great Britain and France can't repay their debt. So the United States agrees to loan Germany the money to pay their debts. So the United States will loan Germany money to pay their debts, and then Germany will pay Great Britain and France what they owe them. Once this is done, then Great Britain and France will be able to repay the United States and get this money back into the American banks. But the American banks are already overextended because they have extended credit to American citizens who can't pay their debts. Republican administrators worsened the problem by raising tariffs on foreign goods, which means it will cost more to buy products from other parts of the world. This, of course, slows the European economic growth at this particular time. So again, to remind you, the bottom 90%, right, the poorest people in the United States really only have about 15% of the income in the United States. But the top 1%, the smallest number, actually have about 70% of the nation's economy. Now, this is important because what it tells us is that the gap between the very wealthy and the very poor is very great. Now, the 1920s are an exciting time. They're an affluent time. People do have more money. They do have the ability to enjoy privacy, to get out, and to do other things. So we see a break with kind of the old morality. Remember, during World War I, that Prohibition Amendment is actually passed. And so it becomes illegal to buy, sell, consume, and transport alcohol. After World War I, 19th century morality and virtues were transformed by this new entertainment industry, which presented Americans with relaxed sexual mores and very attractive stars. For women, film idols modeled the flapper style, reflecting the notion of what was called the new woman. This new woman would wear short skirts and makeup. She might also smoke cigarettes. She would almost certainly drink prohibited alcohol and dance to jazz music. Now, jazz music is really considered African American music, and it becomes something that is consumed by white people, particularly middle class and even the poorest people. Now, in spite of the changing sexual and cultural mores, Americans utilized new entertainment to sustain their religious values. So the new forms of entertainment that are available become something that are used to hold on to the old ways as well as challenge the old ways. At the end of the 1920s, about 40% of American families had radios, and they regularly listened to entertainment and advertising, specifically things like the General Motors Family and the Maxwell House Hour. And these were shows, programs that really helped people to understand what was going on and to sort of teach them what was socially acceptable or not socially acceptable. Intellectual trends reflected the changing culture as well. A group of artists and writers known as the Lost Generation articulated a sense of disenchantment about mass culture, consumerism, corporate capitalism, and they criticized conformity, hypocrisy, small town values, evangelism, and materialism. Psychologists like Sigmund Freud focused on the role of individuals rather than culture in shaping behavior, and he argued that the sex drive and the unconscious mind were the actual driving forces behind human behavior. Though racial stereotypes permeated popular entertainment, such in different shows, particularly the Amos and Andy show, the science around race began to shift in the 1920s when anthropologist Franz Boas asserted that environmental factors rather than heredity created differences in race. So remember, we've had this idea, again, the air quotes, that people are different based on their race, and certain groups are inferior and certain groups are to be over the other. And this really becomes questioned in the 1920s with this idea that a person's environmental factors directly relate to whether or not they have wealth and they have education. The Great Migration highlighted for African Americans the presence of racism in the North, but it also fostered conditions for a cultural renaissance that was centered in New York City's Harlem and the South Side of Chicago. Black intellectuals embraced this new cultural renaissance, declaring that the, quote, new Negro, end quote, rejected white supremacy, embraced racial pride, promoted equality in politics, and celebrated Black history and Black identity. Now, this renaissance included developments in art and literature, and the resulting literature embraced Black heritage and offered a counterpoint to the white cultural norms. Music was central in the development of the cultural renaissance, with performers like Duke Ellington, Jelly Roll Morton, Louis Armstrong, and Bessie Smith perfecting the blues and jazz, moving those forms of music from brothels and bars for Southern Blacks into the Northern entertainment mainstream. Now, it's important to understand that, most bars, certainly brothels, places of that nature, are very much segregated. But this blues music and jazz music is something that is really part of Black culture and Black identity. And remember that a lot of these middle class whites have begun to embrace jazz music. And so we have some of these performers who recognize that and they view this as an opportunity to take this music and put it out to be consumed by white people as well as by African Americans. Now, the Black cultural renaissance fostered the development of a new political vision for African Americans, and this notion of Black nationalism gained momentum, particularly with Marcus Garvey, who was at the center of this movement. In 1914, Marcus Garvey established the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, which celebrated racial pride and separatism and promoted a Back to Africa campaign that encouraged African Americans to move to Africa, unite with Native Africans, and dismantle the colonial system that was in place. Now, Garvey came into conflict with the NAACP because he is promoting this Back to Africa idea, and he's promoting the idea that African Americans should be separate from white people. And he comes into conflict with the NAACP because the NAACP is saying the opposite. They are advocating for integration and an end to separatism or segregation. And Garvey actually accuses the NAACP of accommodating white supremacy and not celebrating Black culture. The UNIA adapted theatrical tactics that celebrated masculinity and femininity. Marcus Garvey would typically dress in a military uniform with a big plume hat, and his wife, Amy Jacques Garvey, would extol kind of political and cultural accomplishments of Black women. And they are very much seen and visible. The UNIA had more than 500,000 members in branches across the United States. But despite the organization's popularity, Garvey made enemies among Black leaders and contributed to his own demise when he was convicted of mail fraud in 1920. 1925. Now, Garvey was arrested and charged with this mail fraud for advertising the sale of stocks in a ship, which his company, the company that he was associated with called the Black Star Line, technically did not own. Now, there were certainly some political motivations against Garvey, and there were also some connections with communism as well. Now, Garvey, of course, is convicted. He's actually sentenced to 5 years in prison. He serves 3 years of that before he is released. And back in 2016, his son actually requested President Barack Obama to pardon him and to kind of expunge this. Now, with this conviction of Marcus Garvey, we really see the demise of, the end of the UNIA. Decades of advocacy by temperance groups culminated in 1920 when the 18th Amendment banned the manufacturing and sale of alcohol. The ban on alcohol soon proved nearly impossible to enforce. In rural areas, people brewed their own moonshine. Speakeasies were littered throughout the big cities, offering clients alcohol and entertainment. Try as they might, they were not able to ban completely alcohol. They could only make it illegal. As World War I ended, a new wave of Southern and Eastern Europeans began to come into the United States. This reignited the anti-Jewish and anti-Catholic prejudices that were already present in the United States and fueled new stereotypes and triggered job competition. In 1920, a case involving two Italian immigrants highlighted concerns about immigration. Now, Seiko and Vanzetti embraced pretty radical views as well as anarchism during World War I. These two were arrested in Massachusetts for a robbery that resulted in two murders. Now, Seiko and Vanzetti were charged. They were tried really on the basis of their foreignness and their political views rather than any evidence that they had really committed the crimes. Now, they did commit the crimes. They were at the robbery. It isn't clear if they were responsible for the murders, but the evidence about the actual crime is not what was really presented and what they were convicted on. And so they were, of course, found guilty, and then they were executed in 1927, even though people in the United States and globally disagreed with this outcome. Now, they were really convicted because they were Italian immigrants, not as much because they had committed a crime. The nativism that we see on display in this case of Seiko and Vanzetti had a less extreme but no less significant manifestations across the United States. This idea of 100% Americanism was held onto by men like Henry Ford and became national sentiment. Henry Ford argued that immigrants chipped away at American morality and civilization, and he firmly embraced anti-Semitism. In his company newspapers, he published the fake Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which he used to validate violence against Jews in Eastern Europe. In 1924, the influence of nativist sentiment contributed to Congress passing the National Origins Act, which was basically a quota system that went into place, and it limited the entry of immigrants from any given country to 2% of the people of that nationality who resided in the United States in 1890. Now, the law severely restricted immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe because there were almost no Southern and Eastern Europeans in the United States. But it also keeps in place this ban on East Asian immigration. Americanization efforts consumed popular attention once immigration was significantly reduced. So two things take place. First is we as a nation reduce the number of immigrants coming into the United States, and the second is that we really shore up the Americanization efforts and mentality. With assimilation and American culture being promoted in factories, schools, patriotic societies, women's organizations, fraternal clubs, and unions, some Catholic churches even began providing confession and sermons in English only, even though the majority of Catholics in the United States were not necessarily English-speaking Americans. For Mexican Americans in the West and the Southwest, Americanization meant not just cultural training, but also education for work in trades and agriculture, as well as low-wage jobs. The federal government had failed to restore funds that were used to aid public health programs for Indian reservations. And although Congress did pass the Indian Citizenship Act in 1924, most American Indians remained outside of the economic and political mainstream. And even though they do gain citizenship in 1924, they don't really participate in politics, government, and voting. The rise of nativism continued to hurt Chinese immigrants who faced discrimination and segregation. More restrictions were placed on immigrants, and in 1924, Asian women were banned from entering the United States. Why women? Well, because women give birth. In spite of Americanization efforts, the United States still did not become a melting pot. Cities around the country continued to be home to those ethnic enclaves, those ghettos, where residents preserved their native culture and religious practices. Now, remember, we've seen an increase in Klan activity in the 1920s. The Klan rose again in 1915 at Stone Mountain, Georgia, and over the next decade and a half, it spread throughout the South and into the North and the West. I mentioned earlier that the Klan sort of reinvented itself. The Klan has historically been a group that are equal opportunity haters. And so initially they targeted African Americans, and now they will widen that net and they will target Catholics, Jews, and anyone else that is deemed to be immoral or un-American, in addition to the African Americans that they are targeting. By the mid-1920s, the Klan boasted a membership of more than 3 million men and women and provided a refuge for native white Protestants who had moved from rural areas into urban areas that had immigrant populations. Though racism and nativism were at the Klan's core, the organization's driving force in the 1920s was the reestablishment of traditional values. So the Klan was able to bring in women participants who were very frustrated with, again, immoral activity. In particular, the people in speakeasies who flaunted the use of alcohol. Particularly, they were kind of saying, well, we're going to do this immoral thing and break the law. So the Klan enjoys membership participation of men and women. The Klan continued to embrace violence and intimidation as key tactics, but it fused those tactics with participation in electoral politics and began to elect representatives, senators, and governors in states across the United States. So the Klan not only rebrands itself a bit, changes its mission, but it also begins to become involved in politics. Now, in the face of vast cultural change, many Protestants clung to traditional values. In 1910, two Los Angeles churchgoers published a series of booklets entitled The Fundamentals, which promoted the literal interpretation of the Bible, and fundamentalist preachers used the new medium of radio to reach new audiences. Among the fundamentalist core concerns was Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, which was first published in 1859. Darwin posited the central role of natural selection and the emergence and development of life. Now, several states, particularly Tennessee, Mississippi, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Florida all passed laws that prohibited the teaching of Darwin's theory in schools and colleges. So K-12 schools and colleges. In Dayton, Tennessee, local businessmen who wanted to bring publicity to the town and the ACLU, citing academic freedom and the right to free speech, decided to challenge the ban by laying the groundwork for what became known as the trial of the century. John Scopes was a high school science teacher and a football coach, and he agreed to defy the law and teach Darwin's theory in his classroom. Now, he agreed to this knowing that he would be fired, that he would come under staunch criticism, but he agrees to do this in spite of that. And of course, there was an immediate trial, and it brought a lot of attention, but it was mainly negative attention to Dayton, Tennessee. The renowned attorney, Clarence Darrow, served as the head of the defense team, and William Jennings Bryan, who is a three-time political candidate for president and former Secretary of State, assisted in the prosecution of John Scopes. John T. Ralston, who was the judge of the trial, opened each session with prayer and ruled that scientists could not testify on the validity of evolution. With no other alternative, Darrow called Bryan, again, Bryan is the prosecuting attorney, Darrow called Bryan to the stand as an expert on the Bible. Now, the jury found Scopes guilty after deliberating for 8 minutes, but the appeals court actually overturned the conviction on a technicality. Now, it's important to understand the court doesn't overturn the conviction because the teacher has the right to teach this scientific theory or because the academic freedom of the teacher has been infringed upon. They overturn the case on a technicality, but anti-evolution laws stay on the books in most states until the 1970s. So the 1920s are a pretty busy time. The Democratic Party was divided in 1924. Southern Democrats united with rural Midwesterners along fundamentalist lines. But Democrats in big cities represented immigrants' interests, rejected prohibition, and supported the political machines. So we have some division within the Democrat Party, and that's important. In 1924, at the Democratic Convention in New York City, Democrats could not pin down a platform because they had such diverse constituencies, such diverse members of their party. Among the issues that proved contentious was the party's support for the Ku Klux Klan. So again, some Democrats are immigrants, they are in urban areas, but a lot of Democrats are those leftover Southern aristocracy, those who support the Klan. The key candidates for the Democratic nomination were John Davis, who was a supporter of Prohibition, and Alfred Smith, who was a Catholic from New York City and who had supported those political machines. Now, Davis wins the Democratic nomination, but he doesn't win the election because there is so much division within the party. So Calvin Coolidge is elected president in 1924. Now I'm going to switch to the next screen just so you can see the folks who supported Davis here. Again, primarily those southern states, and Calvin Coolidge really taking all of those northern states and the West. Now, it is important to recognize Robert M. La Follette, who ran as a progressive third party and does manage to secure Wisconsin. Now, in 1928, urban forces really held sway over the party, and the Democrats nominated Al Smith for president and Senator Joseph Robinson from Arkansas for vice president. Smith was running against Herbert Hoover, who had enormous political clout from his work as director of the Food Administration during World War I and his work as Secretary of Commerce. So he really had name recognition. And as a result, Hoover wins the 1928 election very easily. Now, in spite of his defeat, Smith does help to bring some alignment to the Democratic Party, particularly with urban ethnic minority voters, and does manage to win the country's 12 largest cities, which will be very important for Democrats in the next election. Now, I mentioned Robert M. La Follette. And so it is important to know that even though we're starting to see more defined parties, there are other political parties that do have influence through the 1920s, including socialists like Eugene Debs and progressives, particularly men like Teddy Roosevelt. Now, even though Robert M. La Follette does manage to run as a progressive candidate, he only wins 5 million votes, just that one state. And really, that is the beginning of the end of the Progressive Party. In spite of their failure to maintain a national political party, progressives had influence in the area of conservation, and social workers continued to help them stem the problems of urban poverty. At the same time, we have the Children's Bureau, which helps to provide for some social welfare for young children. So the efforts of the progressives that really begin in the 1890s will continue through the 1920s. And progressives try to retain a lot of political presence, even though there is a massive shift to conservatism in the United States. Their weaknesses, though, really contribute to the failure of the government to curb any corporate or financial excesses. And we will continue into this particular financial decline, which leads to the ultimate financial crash. Now, the date that you want to know here is October 29th, 1929. Now, this is following a panic. So, a couple of things happen. The first thing that happens is stock prices begin to decline very rapidly. And as a result of that, the investors, they want to try to retain some wealth. So, they begin to sell off their shares, and they actually sell off more than 16 million shares, which were worth about $32 billion. So because they're able to sell those shares, they're able to recover what money they can. Though only a very small portion of Americans own stock. Remember, the majority of Americans are very poor and couldn't afford to buy the stock. 1% of the Americans are very wealthy. There's a 20% or so of Americans that fall in that middle class. Though only a small proportion of Americans actually own stock, the crash sends the entire national economy into freefall because many of the investor borrowers had made small down payments on their stock purchases and couldn't repay their creditors once the prices fell. So again, even the wealthiest were buying on credit. Though the crash had an impact on the economy, the Great Depression that followed was a result of an uneven distribution of wealth, an oversupply of goods, a mismanaged credit system, and agricultural decline. Now, all of these events feed into this Great Depression. Now, Herbert Hoover responded to the crisis by lowering taxes on the wealthiest, hoping that they would be encouraged to go out and create new businesses, but they did not. He also increases tariffs. So any kind of goods and services coming into the United States will now cost more. Now, the Federal Reserve actually tries to keep interest rates high, and nations around the world begin to see their economies suffer as well. For the American public, the worsening situation signaled a failure of this laissez-faire government, this laissez-faire economics. And that brings us to the end of chapter 20.